I think the most beautiful thing that I've learned to be able to say to people, those whys, is I don't know, and I totally understand the difficulty of what you're asking and what you're seeing. But what I don't know doesn't cancel out what I do know. The biggest thing that I can say to people in the middle of where they are right now is that your help is like a sonata before God. Even just the word help to a loving father, he's not looking at his children going, now what do you mean when you say help? A cry of help to a loving father is like, oh, that's my kid. And so I think that the honesty is more important than being polished and clean. That it's not a polished and clean Christianity that God is looking for out of you right now. It is the beckoning of truth, and your truth that is the constant that should push you into this place of saying, I don't know how and I don't know what this is, and I need your help.
Part of the beauty of being at the church where I am is it's a church of 5 generations. When I interview and talk to some of the 88, 89-year-old men in our church, not to get political, but I am going to say this, they bless me. One of the hardest days of my pastorate was the day after Mr. Trump got elected. And part of the reason was because of the sense of racial trauma I think that brought. And I'm not arguing for Republican or Democrat, but I guess I just looked the part, and I was sad. And Deacon James Taylor came in to that fellowship hall, and he said, "Oh, Pastor, what's going on with you?" I said, "Man, it's a rough day." He said, "Well, what you mean it's a rough day? It's the sun is shining outside." So I went on to explain to him the election. Of course, he knew. He said, "Oh, we gonna be all right." He said, we lived through Roosevelt and Nixon and Reagan, and he just started going on. He said, "And if God brought us through all of that, this right here ain't no problem." And I tell you, it's the collective witness of our people having endured things that are enormous, a kind of cultural pandemic, and their testimony that they've been to the bottom, but they discovered that there's a rock at the bottom. So that's almost the narrative of Scripture. We are reading the testimonies of people who've walked with God.
I think the most beautiful thing that I've learned to be able to say to people, those whys, is I don't know, and I totally understand the difficulty of what you're asking and what you're seeing. But what I don't know doesn't cancel out what I do know. And then what I do is I shine the light on those areas that I do know. Whether it's personally or in light of Scripture or in light of history. Seeing God's fingerprint in history, seeing God's fingerprint in the history of me personally, that fingerprint, like they said, his fingerprint throughout history of the church, or throughout history of the country. And so by the time I shed the light on what I do know, the things that I don't know, it's not that they become invisible, they just begin to shrink, not act like it doesn't exist, not disrespect the suffering that a person may go through, but we shed light on all the areas that we do understand and experience.
I think the Scriptures paint for us a picture of a God who is all-knowing, all-wise, who lives outside of time and space. And so he's not affected per se by time and space, but he sees all of the events of life as happening at once, and yet he is still in control. And the challenge of that is that we're finite creatures. So we do not fully comprehend how God can be all that he is and still let things play out the way that they are. But the reason we say that is because we only see up to the right now. We do not see the not yet. God is so much God that he has figured out every possible contingency. So in a world that is affected by evil and suffering, we can't handle those heavyweight questions. And nobody in their right mind is going to sit on a podcast like this and tell you they got answers for all of these. We don't. But we do know that God really does cause all things to work together for our good. That doesn't mean that God causes all things to happen,
Yeah.
It means that God causes them to work together. George Bernard Shaw said, wisely quipped once, that God made us in his image and we return the favor. We have made of God what we want God to be. That's part of the problem with the question of suffering too. It is that when God doesn't do what we want God to do, then he's no longer God. And so we trade that version of God for our own version of God, our own made up version of God. And the problem with our concept of the goodness of God is that we determine what's good. And so when God works outside of that framework, he's no longer good, or that ain't God. If he's not God enough to disagree with you, then he ain't God.
Yeah.
If he's not God enough to say what it is, and it is what it is, but you get to retort and make it what you want to be, then you're God. The goodness of God is not just me getting rich during the pandemics, investing money into the right medical profile. The goodness of God is not just this thing being done. We all want it to be done. Lord knows I want it to be done. But the goodness of God is God took care of my biggest problem.
Yes,
he handled my greatest pain. Yes. The greatest pandemic in the world is that sin keeps me from God. Mm-hmm. And he fixed that. So even if death comes, which it has hit our own congregation, even if death comes, there is a beauty in being able to see him face to face on the backside of suffering.